Hi. In this lecture and the next one, I'm going to take on the question of why cultures differ and why we see consistency within those cultures. Now, to understand why cultures differ, what we're going to do is we're going to extend our pure coordination game, and we're going to extend it to multiple games. And the reason we're going to do this is we want to try and get some understanding of why is it the case that we see Protestant Europe up here, Africa down here, Latin America down here, and so on. We want to try and understand why do we see these differences across cultures. To do that, what we want to do is recognize that we play more than one coordination game. We play lots of coordination games. So here's some examples. Okay, so this is going to be fun. And let's just ask these questions. Do people wear shoes in your house? So when people come to your house, do they take off their shoes when they enter, or do they leave them on? Do you cross the street when the don't walk sign is flashing? So if you're in some city and you're at the intersection and there's a little don't walk sign, do you wait or do you cross? Do you read the newspaper at the breakfast table? So if your family's sitting around having breakfast, are you reading the newspaper or reading on your computer, or are you talking to people? Do you hug your friends when you see them? Or do you shake hands or bow? And do you interrupt someone who's talking? Each of these situations is a pure coordination game. If everybody else is wearing shoes in the house, you don't want to take your shoes off because you're going to get dirt all over your feet. If you're walking with friends and they don't cross the street when the sign is flashing and you do, then they're standing on one side of the street and you're standing on the other. If you read the newspaper at the breakfast table and the other person's hoping to engage in conversation, well, they're going to be staring at your newspaper. If you go to hug your friends and they go to bow or shake hands, that's going to be awkward, right? It's important that you do the same thing. And finally, on interruption, if you're in a culture where people interrupt, then it's totally okay, and you sort of understand that in the context of the conversation. But if you're in a culture where people don't interrupt and somebody interrupts you, then you get completely caught off guard and it disrupts the flow of the conversation, and people can get angry at one another. So it's important that we have an understanding of what the other people are doing so that we can coordinate on these behaviors. So think about how you answered those questions, and I'll give you my answers to those questions. Do people wear shoes inside my house? No. Do I cross the street when the don't walk sign is flashing? Unfortunately, yes, because that's what people in Ann Arbor do. Do I read the newspaper at the breakfast table? I'm embarrassed to say yes, I do. Do I hug my friends when I see them? Yes. And do I interrupt people when they're talking? Again, yes, but that's, again, part of the culture of the academy. When people are giving presentations, you raise your hand and you interrupt them, or you say, wait a minute, I have a question, because it's all about having a productive dialogue. Now, I don't always. In some situations, I'll recognize that it's inappropriate for me to interrupt. But generally speaking, these are my behaviors. Now, if you answered no, yes, 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 then you're my people. You're part of my culture. We're the same. We belong in the same place on Englehart's map. Now, if you didn't, from a different cultural group, at least on these 5 dimensions. So let's think about it for a second. Suppose we just had 20 coordination games, and we could think of 50 or 60. One quiz I sometimes give my undergrads is to say, okay, think of 5 coordination games that you have to play every day. And for the first 20 minutes, they'll be like, that's a really hard question. And then all of a sudden, they can think of 10 or 20. Because so much of what we do, it's important that we coordinate with the people around us. Even things like going to bed early or going to bed late, you have to coordinate. What time you eat, what order you eat your salad and your meal in. All sorts of things are coordination games. So if we assume there's just 20 of these coordination games, and there's 2 answers to each one, some of them have maybe 5 or 6 answers, but let's just suppose each one's just a yes or no thing, then we get 2 raised to the 20th power, which is bigger than 1,000,000. So there's 1,000,000 different cultures you could get just with these 20 coordination games. So if we want to ask why do cultures differ, we get this paradoxical result. They differ because everybody's trying to coordinate. And if we're trying to coordinate within our culture, most likely we're going to coordinate on stuff that's different than what another culture does. And that means that the 2 cultures are going to differ. Let's push this a little bit further, and I'm going to do something called Bob Axelrod's culture model. So Bob's a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan. He wrote this model of cultural emergence, and a lot of people use this. This is a widely cited paper to understand sort of how cultures emerge and why we see boundaries between cultures. So here's how Axelrod sets this up. He creates a set of features. Now these features are like the coordination games. They're things on, like, whether you read the newspaper at the table, where you store your ketchup, which side of the road you drive on, that sort of thing. Then there's traits, and the traits are what action you take on that feature. So for example, if you think about how you greet people, instead of just being shaking hands or bowing, it could be shake hands, bow, kiss on the cheek, hug, all sorts of things, waves. So instead of there just being 2 options, there could be a bunch of options. There could be 7 options, 10 options, 12 options. So a person is just this vector of traits on features, just like we talked about. Do you wear shoes in the house? Do you store your ketchup in the fridge? Do you read the newspaper at the table? That sort of stuff. What Axelrod then does is he puts people in social space. So each person, each one of these little dots, has a person in it. Then the last assumption he makes, which is an interesting one, is that after you assign these values, you pick a person, and then that person looks to their left or to their right or north or south in those 4 neighborhoods around them, and they say, do I want to interact with this person that I see? So if you look back at this picture, this person looks up and they see this person sitting up here. So they look up here and look at that person and think, boy, do I want to interact with that person? And what he assumes is you interact with a probability that's equal to the similarity between you. So you basically look across the traits and ask, what's the probability we agree on a trait? So if you don't agree at all, then you say, look, that person seems lit on, I'm not going to interact with you. If you agree on everything, you interact for sure, but then you don't have to change anything. If you agree on 70% of the traits, then what you do is you say, well, we're pretty similar. And then what you do is you pick a feature, randomly pick one of those features, and then match the trait with that person. Now, it could be you already matched that person on that trait, which is fine. But if you don't, then you'll switch and match. So here in a nutshell is the idea. We're in this social space. If someone's somewhat like us, we interact with them. And if we interact with them, we're playing a coordination game. And so we're going to match in that game. Now, if we interact in a game that we're already matching, great. And we also are, again, the big assumption here is if we meet someone who's very different from us, we choose not to play with them, and so therefore we don't change our behavior. The question is, what happens? Well, let's set up the following model. Let's suppose that we've got 5 features and 10 values, 4 neighbors, and we can let the similarity be just the percentage of traits that you agree with the other person. So we'll set up that model and see what happens. So before 2 people meet, we think of having a leader and a follower. And what's going to happen is the leader may look like this, and the follower looks like this. Now, the probability these 2 people are going to meet is going to be 40%. Why? Because they agree on this trait, and they agree on this trait, so they agree on 5 traits. I'm sorry, 2 traits, 2 out of 5. That's 40%. If they decide to meet, then what's going to happen is, and they also then decide to look at this second game, player 2 is going to change their 1, the follower is going to change their 1 to a 3 to match the other person. So this is sort of how the model works. Nothing very complicated. So we're going to do this in NetLogo, and here I'll do it with 5 features, and I guess I've got 12 traits. This is the NetLogo model, and I've actually put a link to this on your website because this is one that's not in the models library. So on the syllabus, there's a link to this NetLogo model. So I'm going to set this up, and the thing to notice here is that these checkerboards, each in the center of each square is a person, and the boundaries around them, the thickness of the boundary, tells the likelihood, the probability that you match the person above you. So if that line is really dark, it means you don't match them at all. And if it's lighter, it means you match them with high probability. So I'm going to let this thing go, and it's ticking along. And what you see is a graph here is the number, the black line shows the number of different regions in the space, and the red line shows the size of the largest region. And the little dots on the graph are showing sort of the centroid, the center mass of each of these regions. And as I let this go, what you see is the number of regions are falling. The culture is becoming similar. The largest region is also growing, but you still see that we're maintaining some cultural heterogeneity, right? There's some differences. Now, if I speed this up and let it run until it stops, what I get, which is sort of interesting, is I get separate cultures. So I've got 4 different cultures here in a way. Or I've got 5, I got this little one. So there's one little one here, and these other little cultures. And what you also see is there's thick boundaries around them. That each one of these cultures has thick boundaries to the cultures they adjoin to. They have to have those thick boundaries. Because if they didn't have those thick boundaries, people would interact with their neighbors across those boundaries, and then they become similar. So what Axelrod's model gives, which is really interesting, is it gives us that these similar regions emerge, but then you get multiple cultures, and the boundaries between those cultures are thick. And the reason they're thick is that if they weren't thick, people would interact across those cultural boundaries, and they become similar. So what Axelrod's model gives us, which is really sort of fascinating, is he makes this assumption that says we've all got these traits. We look to our neighbors. If they're like us, we tend to interact with them. If they're not like us, we tend not to. And what he ends up getting is these distinct cultures with thick boundaries, and these thick boundaries means vast differences between the cultures. Now the thick boundaries emerge because of the fact that if there weren't a thick boundary, then what would happen is I would interact with that person and we'd become more similar and the boundary would disappear. So Axelrod's model shows how in a social space we can get distinct cultures on multi-dimensions, and those boundaries can be self-reinforcing. People don't interact across the boundaries and the cultures remain disparate. So Axelrod model is really powerful. It tells us how cultures can emerge and how distinct cultures can emerge with these thick boundaries or thick walls between them. What it leaves out, though, and this is where we're going to go next, is any notion of consistency within a culture. Now that wasn't what he used the model to construct. It's not really so much a weakness of the model. It's not something he was focusing on. But where we want to go next is we want to ask, can we construct a model that will give us that as well? So now we've got this baseline model, the Axelrod model. We want to ask, can we go one level deeper and actually get consistency within the culture as well? And within that model, can we say anything about whether it's going to converge and whether or not it explains other features of cultures that interest us? Okay, thanks.